and then wages are being pushed up, you get more industrial unrest, and you really need a deep recession in order to bring inflation back down.
Welcome to Dream Richer. Over the last couple of months, we have began to hear a specific word over and over again. That word is inflation. Everything from the Feds raising interest rates and central banks printing more money to the Russia-Ukraine war has taken a huge toll on every country's economy. When Russia invaded Ukraine, no one knew how long the ensuing conflict would last, or how deep the shockwaves sent through Europe or the rest of the world would be. However, the economic fallout from the conflict is becoming clearer, and the outlook does not look good. Against an already turbulent backdrop of global inflationary pressures amid rising food and energy prices and disrupted supply chains following the corona pandemic, the war between Russia and Ukraine is exacerbating supply and demand tensions, damaging consumer sentiment, and is threatening global economic growth. Concerns over rising prices are prompting investors to sell bonds, pushing yields higher. Hence, the whole market is in a total state of confusion. By the end of this video, Mervyn, the former governor of the Bank of England, unravels the concept of inflation and how it may play out exactly like the 1900s. If you find the video helpful, then don't forget to subscribe. Let's get right into it.
I think the best definition of getting away from inflation is when people stop talking about it. And sadly, today they are talking about it. And basically, inflation turns a healthy economy into a sick one because it becomes a process of constant catch-up. You know, your wage goes up, then it's my turn later on to bargain a wage. I start to think you're getting paid more than I am, then you think I'm getting paid more than you. It makes it very difficult for people to work out how expensive things are, whose wage is higher than somebody else's. And that makes it almost impossible for an economy to function because you don't know what the cheapest sources of supply or inputs are, what the cheapest kind of labor is, and what kind of job to take. And certainly when inflation reached over 25% in the 1970s, this was something that really started to wreck the way the whole economy worked. The first is that people, I think, decided that when the pandemic hit, because output in the economy contracted, the right thing to do was to print a lot more money to stimulate spending, to try and bring demand back up. But that's not what the pandemic was about. The pandemic was about shutting down parts of the economy quite deliberately in order to prevent the spread of the disease. And that meant that if you simply print lots of money at a time when you're producing less, you've got a classic case of too much money chasing too few goods. And the result of that is inflation. And we started to see that last year in 2021. That was the first, I think, mistaken idea. And it's interesting that it was common to all central banks. They basically felt we must demonstrate that we're here, we must do something. But governments were doing a great deal through, in our case, the furlough scheme, which was very sensible. Other governments had their own schemes. This was a very sensible thing to do, but it didn't need central banks to print lots of extra money on top of all that. That's generated a rise in inflation, followed by the mistake, of course, that now I think have understandably worried about the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on energy and food prices, which is not the responsibility of central banks. So that's pushed inflation up further, but it would have been above target in any event. It will come down next year and the year after. The question is, will it come down to 2% where it's supposed to be?
As Mr. Mervyn argues, our economy is shaping up like the 1900s when economy entered hyperinflation. For example, in 1922, hyperinflation took hold of the German economy. During periods of inflation, prices rise continuously as the value of a currency drops sharply. Many European countries experienced inflation after the war, but nowhere did prices rise as rapidly as they did in Germany. On some days, the value of the German currency fell hourly. As a result of the inflation, Germans who had their savings in banks or were living on pensions or disability checks found themselves virtually bankrupt. Workers increasingly discovered that no matter how high their wages rose, they could not keep up with rapidly soaring prices. The grim poverty, the hopelessness, the ineffective laws governing the crisis all made people wish for a miracle to fix the economy.
You should be asking yourself the question, what do we think is going on here? If we keep printing money at this rate, what will happen? And the answer is obvious: you'll get inflation. But people have stopped thinking about it in those simple terms, and they've become obsessed, I think, with complex models, which can be helpful in some circumstances, but it's not a description of how the world works. And I think just asking the simple question, what is going on here, is a very important one to ask, because the pandemic was not like the sort of business cycles we'd seen in the past, where people lose confidence, stop investing and spending. You then cut interest rates to stimulate demand, to get back to where the economy can produce. That wasn't the position at all in the pandemic. The governments and households basically decided, well, we're going to stop functioning for a while. Once supply goes down, the worst thing you can do at that point is to increase demand, because there's a real imbalance between the two. And if you stimulate money demand at the same time as output is contracting, the result is going to be inflation. Now, the good news here is that they're not printing money at that rate anymore. That stopped. So we can expect inflation to come back down. The real question, I think, is how deep will the recession have to be? The big lesson from the 1970s was the two central banks that were the most determined to bring inflation back down in the 70s and took strong action to do so, the Bundesbank in Germany and the Swiss National Bank. Not only were they more successful in bringing inflation down, they actually had the lowest recessions. By tackling inflation early, they prevented the need to keep raising rates in order to create a deeper recession, to stop an ingrained wage price spiral pushing inflation up. And that's what's most important. We've been through 30 years where people have got used to low inflation. They've accepted it. They've stopped talking about inflation. Unless we get back to that as quickly as possible, the risk is that people do start to worry about inflation all the time, and then wages are being pushed up, you get more industrial unrest, and you really need a deep recession in order to bring inflation back down. Let's hope we don't need to do that.
That really is the 1970s.
But that would be the 1970s. Now, we're not there yet, but it will need a very clear statement and signal by central banks to make sure that we don't end up there.
It's clear from Mervyn King's explanation that the world is facing several such forces at once, like food shortages, inflation, the persistence of pandemic, and the effects of global warming. Taken together, they threaten the stability and prosperity of nations around the world. That threat could hasten the retreat that many countries are already making away from globalization and international cooperation. The U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, which is charged with keeping inflation under control, was initially slow to respond, but it is now moving urgently to cool demand for goods and services by raising borrowing costs. On Wednesday, the Fed raised its benchmark interest rate by 0.75 percentage point, which is an unusually large jump. Do you think our economy will recover, or will we see tragic events before that time? Let us know in comments below. To learn more about the latest crypto news, watch these videos here.